The initial perception of the current state of the United States slowly unravels when one observes, with the detachment of a documentary camera, the gap between the official narrative and the real scenario found in the streets, suburbs, and pockets forgotten by the mainstream media. The image of the country that for decades was exalted as a symbol of prosperity, stability, and social ascension begins to fragment when evidence emerges that a large part of the population is trapped in exhausting routines, burdened by debt, and unable to keep up with the continuous escalation of basic costs that have transformed daily survival into a permanent struggle. Silent streets, empty buildings, and parking lots occupied by workers sleeping in their vehicles reveal more than isolated signs of hardship. They expose a sense of weariness that spreads like a dense fog over a territory that once represented the peak of the global economic dream. This contrast between promise and reality is amplified by statistics showing increasing indebtedness, stagnant wages, and an almost compulsory dependence on credit to maintain minimum living standards. Propaganda still insists that the country remains vigorous, but the common people, crushed by financial obligations, realize that the old security has become a distant memory. The discrepancy between what is said and what is experienced produces a discomfort that seeps into the collective consciousness, revealing that the problem lies not only in the economy, but in the carefully constructed narrative designed to preserve an artificial sense of normalcy. At this point, an inevitable question arises like an unsettling noise that cuts across the surface, forcing the viewer to reflect on something that no one openly discusses. If all of this is so obvious, why do so many still believe that nothing is wrong? And perhaps the answer will reveal more than the country is willing to admit. What illusion do you think keeps this collapse invisible? If this question also made you see something that nobody talks about, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and leave a like now. This ensures that you follow the next revelations and helps us continue investigating what many still prefer to ignore. When one carefully observes the recent behavior of American cities, it becomes clear that collapse isn't arriving. It has already silently taken hold and become part of the daily lives of millions of people who try to maintain a semblance of normalcy while facing increasingly complex difficulties. Long lines at food banks, entire neighborhoods emptied by forced relocations, and families sharing makeshift spaces in trailers or parking lots become visual indicators of a profound transformation that, despite being evident, continues to be treated by the institutional narrative as a set of temporary circumstances that will soon be overcome. Reality, however, demonstrates that this deterioration is not restricted to vulnerable groups, but directly affects the working class that previously occupied a relatively stable position in the country's social fabric. The rampant rise in the cost of living pushes workers into increasingly degrading conditions, forcing many to accumulate exhausting workdays that still do not guarantee financial security. Persistent inflation, combined with stagnant wages, dissolves the capacity for planning and transforms any unforeseen event into an immediate threat to domestic survival. Internal. Migration reveals a population that does not move in search of new opportunities, but rather flees unsustainable expenses, creating urban spaces marked by silent decay. Closed shops, abandoned warehouses, and streets with sparse activity become symbols of a country that tries to hide its structural fissures under a layer of increasingly fragile optimism. As these signs accumulate and paint an increasingly clear picture of the situation, the viewer is led to realize that what is called a symptom is, in fact, part of a much deeper process than the surface suggests. And when the origin of these events is closely analyzed, evidence emerges that this crisis did not arise by chance, inevitably leading to the question that opens the next section. If the symptoms are already so evident, what exactly is at work behind this deterioration? When one investigates the progressive weakening of the American middle class in depth, it becomes clear that the crisis did not emerge spontaneously, nor did it develop through a succession of random misfortunes, but was shaped by an economic mechanism that depends on a permanent sense of stability to keep people too busy to question its foundations. Behind the consumption indicators, the optimistic reports, and the official rhetoric that insists on predicting imminent recoveries, there is a carefully aligned structure to transform credit into a universal solution, even when this resource becomes the very trap that imprisons millions in ever-growing debts that never keep pace with their salaries. This almost compulsory dependence creates a convincing illusion of accessible prosperity, while in practice, it deepens the financial vulnerability of families who believe they are on the right track by following guidelines that favor only institutions that profit from each new installment added to the household budget. The gap between credit expansion and income stagnation produces a slow, suffocating effect, perceptible only to those who analyze. The scenario without the filter of advertising campaigns or government speeches. Large corporations benefit from policies that prioritize their interests, while workers deal with insufficient wage adjustments, benefit cuts, and increasingly intense demands that consume their energy without offering real prospects for advancement. The official narrative that the market will adjust naturally acts as a psychological buffer, preventing the population from realizing that the ongoing process is not a passing fluctuation, but the direct consequence of structural choices that favor income concentration and the gradual weakening of the pillars that supported the middle class. As these hidden mechanisms become more evident to those observing the bigger picture, a disturbing feeling arises that the crisis is not merely a consequence, but a predictable result of decisions that benefit a few and sacrifice many. And, in understanding this logic, the next inevitable step is to confront what these causes unleash in daily life. If this is the silent force at work beneath the surface of the economy, what impacts is it about to unleash? When the invisible mechanisms that shape economic behavior begin to produce concrete effects on people's daily lives, the transformation ceases to be a silent process and takes on proportions that affect not only individual lives, but also the social structure that has sustained the country for decades. In medium-sized cities, once recognized as spaces of stability and upward mobility, signs of deterioration multiply, revealing an irreversible advance of precarization. The combination of formal job losses, small business closures, and forced displacements creates a landscape marked by empty buildings, sparsely populated streets, and fragmented communities that can no longer maintain the vitality that once fueled their growth. Economic fragility spreads unevenly but consistently, first affecting the least visible places and then advancing into regions that previously seemed immune to this phenomenon. The inability to keep up with the continuously rising cost of living forces entire families to reorganize their routines around multiple work shifts, even though these efforts are insufficient to guarantee minimum safety reserves. The emotional consequences of this process emerge gradually, manifesting as persistent exhaustion, feelings of powerlessness, and loss of perspective, factors that compromise social cohesion and increase collective vulnerability. Financial overload transforms simple unforeseen events into family crises, and the absence of effective protection policies creates an environment where any economic fluctuation can trigger devastating effects. What was once interpreted as temporary instability is now recognized as a profound structural change, indicating that the traditional pillars supporting the middle class no longer offer the necessary support. As these impacts accumulate and become impossible to ignore, the perception arises that the deterioration is no longer restricted to isolated pockets, but extends like a continuous current advancing towards larger urban centers, preparing the ground for a phenomenon that transcends financial indicators and reaches emotional and existential dimensions. If these consequences are already shaping the present, what happens when the collapse ceases to be external and begins to take root within people? When the economic impact ceases to manifest itself solely in numbers and begins to occupy the intimate space of human relationships, a dimension of collapse emerges that few can immediately recognize because it does not appear abruptly, but slowly infiltrates daily life, transforming habits, perceptions, and feelings without generating obvious noise. In large metropolises, The excess of visual and auditory stimuli masks a growing loneliness that affects people of different income levels, although it becomes especially intense among those who, pressured by financial obligations and exhausting routines, gradually distance themselves from community and family ties. This silent disconnection is reinforced by the advancement of technology, which, although it facilitates superficial interactions, reduces the time dedicated to deep relationships, creating a diffuse feeling of isolation even in densely populated environments. The relentless pursuit of productivity, fueled by discourses that equate human value with the ability to work, produces emotional exhaustion that manifests as persistent fatigue, difficulty maintaining purpose, and loss of interest in activities that once symbolized well-being. Many people end up living in a state of continuous alert, monitoring bills, deadlines, and pending tasks, while neglecting essential aspects of their own emotional health. In condominiums lit up during the early morning hours, it is possible to observe windows revealing apartments occupied by individuals who, despite apparent stability, carry a permanent feeling of emptiness that finds no solution in consumption or professional goals. This phenomenon is not limited to isolated psychological issues, but is integrated into a broader crisis, as it contributes to the disintegration of communities and the weakening of support networks that have historically acted as social buffers in times of difficulty. When loneliness spreads at the same time as the economy falters, it creates fertile ground for the emergence of defensive behaviors and feelings of insecurity that transcend the individual sphere. And it is precisely at this point that a new layer of collapse emerges, this time supported by something that can hardly be disputed. The numbers prove what this silent feeling has been trying to warn us about for years. The statistical dimension of the crisis clearly reveals what, until now, could only be interpreted as subjective perception, since the indicators accumulated over the last few years form an unequivocal portrait of a society that has lost the capacity to sustain the model of prosperity that defined it for decades. Data collected by independent institutes show that a large part of the population lives in debt at levels that surpass any recent historical precedent, while the cost of living is advancing much faster than any salary adjustment. Debt related to the use of credit cards has reached levels reminiscent of periods of severe crisis, and dependence on food assistance programs is growing steadily, indicating that financial insecurity is no longer a problem restricted to vulnerable groups and has begun to affect entire segments of the former middle class. Housing reports indicate a significant increase in the number of families allocating more than half of their income to rent alone, drastically reducing their savings capacity and jeopardizing any possibility of future stability. Simultaneously, the closure of small businesses, which historically acted as engines of the local economy, is increasing structural unemployment and further weakening the country's productive base. Default rates, which had been artificially contained by temporary stimulus measures, are once again rising rapidly, reinforcing the perception that the financial system is supported by a fragile structure incapable of withstanding prolonged pressure. These numbers don't operate in isolation. Together, they paint a picture that refutes the narrative of recovery and exposes a reality that is increasingly distant from the optimism advocated by official speeches. The coldness of the statistics prevents alternative interpretations, as the data reveal a country facing a process of continuous erosion in which stability disintegrates even when headlines insist on stating the opposite. And when these indicators are analyzed as a coherent set, a disturbing question arises that inevitably leads to the next section. If the reality is already reflected in the numbers, what else is needed for the collapse to become impossible to hide? When the data ceases to offer any room for optimistic interpretations, the scenario demands a broader reading, capable of connecting isolated statistics to the profound transformations slowly unfolding in the country's social fabric. What could previously be classified as a set of passing difficulties now reveals itself as the advanced stage of a process that compromises not only the domestic economy, but also the very identity built around the idea of stability, upward mobility, and security. Projections prepared by independent experts show that the combination of structural debt, loss of purchasing power, and urban depopulation creates an environment in which any new economic fluctuation has the potential to trigger significant disruptions, especially in regions where public infrastructure already shows clear signs of deterioration. As these trends intensify, a silent movement of population displacement emerges, reshaping cities, altering consumption patterns, and weakening production chains, amplifying the impacts of a crisis that can no longer be treated as a one-off event. This phenomenon, coupled with the increasing difficulty of accessing essential services, creates the perfect conditions for social tensions to transform into open conflicts, as the feeling of insecurity becomes permanent and permeates different socio-economic groups. The simultaneous worsening of economic, emotional, and structural factors produces a climate of instability that spreads rapidly, suggesting that the country is approaching a tipping point where old containment strategies will no longer be sufficient to control the deterioration. The imminence of a more severe scenario is not presented as a prophecy, but as a predictable consequence of choices accumulated over decades, choices that prioritized immediate results at the expense of social sustainability. Numerous studies make it evident that the continuation of this process will not only deepen inequality, but will irreversibly transform the way American society organizes itself, coexists, and projects its collective future. And when it becomes clear that this warning does not describe a distant risk, but a state that is approaching at an increasing speed, the question that concludes the analysis cycle and leads to the inevitable conclusion remains: what is left for a country when even its illusions cease to serve as protection? When considering the full body of evidence presented throughout this analysis, it becomes impossible to maintain the old view that the observed phenomena represent merely natural fluctuations in an economic cycle. The succession of symptoms, the root causes, and the social impacts reveal that the country is undergoing a transformation process that alters not only financial indicators, but also the collective perception of security, belonging, and purpose. This change, though silent, affects psychological and emotional dimensions that are rarely mentioned in official discourse, as they expose a type of vulnerability that cannot be circumvented by emergency policies or optimistic narratives. The feeling that something essential has been lost along the way becomes increasingly evident, creating an environment in which many are no longer sure whether they are fighting against an external crisis or against their own inner exhaustion. Understanding this scenario leads to reflection on the role that illusions have played in attempting to preserve an ideal that no longer finds support in the daily experience of most of the population. The insistence on believing that stability is still within reach fuels a kind of social blindness that prevents the recognition of the profound transformations affecting the present and shaping the future. When illusions finally crumble, they reveal not only the fragility of the system, but also the need for an honest reassessment of what it truly means to prosper in a context marked by increasing inequality and emotional exhaustion. The question that arises, therefore, is not only how the country reached this point, but how it will choose to reinterpret its collective meaning after the dissolution of its old certainties. In this final moment, when narratives unravel and reality reveals itself with its inescapable harshness, the viewer is left to decide whether to continue observing from a distance or to choose to understand in depth the mechanisms that shape their own life. If this content has opened your eyes to something that few dare to discuss, subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. Your voice is an essential part of this conversation that the system prefers to avoid.